Okay, the Thursday, June 21st meeting of the Water Quality Management Committee will come to order. Before we get into our agenda, I'd like to point out the presence of two reporters in the room, both new to us. Could you introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Steve Whitbrow. I'm from the Falmouth Enterprise.
Steve, nice to have you.
And I'm Samantha Fields of WCAI with radio station.
Terrific. Thank you for joining us. Also with us is Richard Hale from Treetops, Bill Kerford from the OPET organization, Oyster Pond Environmental Trust, Jerry Patamus, a longtime participant in these activities, and our league lady, Miriam. Nice to have you. The first item on the agenda is the Oyster Pond Draft CWMP Overview. By way of background for our new reporters and others, back in 2011, when the town created this committee and voted some financial support to make things happen, there were two CWMPs, comprehensive wastewater permits, that the town authorized to move ahead and put in some money to do that. One of them was for the 5 coastal ponds on the south coast, basically from Falmouth Harbor over to Wacoit. The other one was Oyster Pond, and that's why we're here today. For the last couple of years, this committee's been working with the neighbors, with the DEP, with our consultant, Ed Leonard, on options that might work in Oyster Pond to reduce the nitrogen to a level that it needs to be. Today, Ed is here to sort of revisit in a brief way where we've come from and where he and we are now, and where he thinks we ought to be going.
All right, thank you for having me here today to go through the Oyster Pond project. As Eric said, we're going to go at an overview level and give you an opportunity to ask questions. So a CWMP is a comprehensive wastewater management plan. What we do in that process is identify water quality needs in this case for Oyster Pond, identify options and solutions to address those water quality needs, and identify funding, approaches, and a schedule. For this project, the primary driver is the Massachusetts Estuaries Project. There's what's called a TMDL, Total Maximum Daily Load, which is a technical report issued by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection and the Massachusetts Estuaries Project that says how much nitrogen needs to be removed. And I'll talk about that as we progress here. So this project started in 2013. We presented the needs assessment phase to this committee in October of 2013. We then proceeded to an alternatives analysis phase. We presented the initial results of that in June 2014 and to the public in July 2014. There was a fairly lengthy pause as the town was considering its larger wastewater management needs town-wide. We revisited the alternatives analysis in September and October of 2017 based on questions and comments raised by this committee and the working group and members of the interested public. So that report was issued in October 2017. We've restarted this process now to develop the recommended plan and intend to finish that in 2019. And again, that's going to need to be consistent with what this group is envisioning for the rest of the town, the town-wide needs. So Oyster Pond, in brief, it's a 63-acre pond. It's brackish water. It's generally shallow, but there's 3 deep holes, quote-unquote deep holes, and it's managed at a low salinity level, targeting 2 to 4 ppt salinity through a weir that exists at the outlet of the pond. Historically, these were just kettle ponds. As sea level rose, it backflooded the pond. It was saltwater, longshore drifts eventually cut that off, and it turned to a freshwater pond. The town installed a weir to basically regulate the amount of salt water that went in and fresh water that went out to make it a managed salinity pond. It was listed as impaired by DEP in 2006, and it's been studied since that time. So the key issues in Oyster Pond are the significant majority of the development that's occurred in that watershed has occurred since 1977, and most of the dwelling units are within a 10-year travel time. So it's essentially at steady state, above its ability to assimilate the nitrogen that's going into it. The water column nitrogen in the pond is relatively high and quite variable, and that's in part due to thermal stratification, seasonal thermal stratification, density stratification, which occurs with storm events based on salinity, as well as longshore drifts putting sand in the outlet of the river that comes out of the pond. And that disrupts the managed state of the pond and causes some problems in and of itself. So there's a handful of key issues here. From a needs assessment perspective, we looked at numerous categories of need, from sanitary, we're having issues with breakout on the surface. We look at surface water protection, drinking water protection, and build out. And for this watershed, surface water protection and build out are the needs that need to be addressed. We identified the wastewater flows that need alternative management. And so under the current condition, that was 28,900 gallons per day. And based on a practical build-out scenario, it was 34,500 gallons per day.
That's additional
in the
or the new number?
That's total.
Okay.
So it's an additional 5,600 gallons. Not a lot of growth in the watershed. So the TMDL, total maximum daily load, was issued in 2008. For reasons only known to MEP, they work in kilograms per day. But essentially the current load is 5.2 kilograms per day, and the threshold is 1.44 kilograms per day. So the existing condition is substantially over what's considered the threshold, or the ability of the water body to assimilate the load. So the TMDL calls for 77% reduction in that nitrogen load. What we suggested, so that nitrogen load consists of just natural background conditions. About 70% of it, though, is wastewater, 72% of it. There's also 15% or so that comes from the atmosphere, just through dry and wet deposition. And then there's land use, which is primarily a stormwater fertilizer component. So we had suggested dealing with the wastewater component, but also considering that we can do things to monitor, track, and account for other changes related to stormwater, fertilizer, and atmospheric trends. And so that's what we carried forward from the needs assessment to the alternatives analysis. So what we call baseline measures, things that are part of every alternative that we put forward. Wastewater management, the town already has implemented fertilizer and flow neutral regulations, so we accounted for that. We accounted for what are called stormwater best management practices, which is essentially some amount of treatment on stormwater, whether it's vegetated swales, rain gardens, things like that, where you try and mitigate the pollution from just everyday stormwater. And maintaining that trunk river outlet so that the water body can stay at its target salinity. We considered a number of alternative measures. These are things that town has done. Falmouth has done quite a number of pilot projects in the different watersheds in town. These were all considered for Oyster Pond, but they were eliminated for various reasons, which I won't get into now, but we can discuss if anybody has questions on them. So we identified 6 plans, what we call composite plans. So one is to sewer the area and pump that sewage to the town's Blacksmith Shop Road wastewater treatment facility. The second was to sewer the area and collaborate with Woods Hole Oceanographic to expand their existing treatment facility. The third was to construct a new, small, decentralized treatment facility in the watershed for the watershed. The fourth was to not sewer anything, but have homeowners put in what we call enhanced innovative alternative systems, denitrifying systems on their property at a technology level that exists today. The fifth was what we called advanced IA systems. So these are systems that are really still in the proving phase. The West Falmouth Harbor shoreline remediation project is ongoing. It's doing installation and testing. This is Falmouth's project. Testing higher performance systems, and that's what this Plan 5 is. And Plan 6 is no action. So we did a cost analysis of each of these options, including looking at what are the septic system replacement costs and septic pumping costs of no action, to having everybody remove their septic system and connect to a sewer and pump to the plant for Plan 1. So based on that cost analysis, we eliminated Plans 2, 3, 4, and 6, and are left with Plans 1 and 5, which I'll talk more about now. So Plan 1 is sewer to the town's treatment facility. Sorry, I should go back and say one thing. In terms of the current future conditions, there's 225 dwelling units in the watershed under current conditions, and 243 dwelling units under the practical build-out condition. So that's relevant right here. So in terms of Plan 1, we have 172 dwelling units that would be served under this plan, which is about 70% of the watershed. The benefits of that is it removes the nitrogen from all of those dwelling units entirely, in their entirety, takes it somewhere else, treats it, and disposes of it outside of the watershed. It meets the TMDL. It also removes phosphorus. Based on our analysis, phosphorus is somewhat of a limiting nutrient in this pond at various times of the year. So there's a benefit from that regard. It would reduce the freshwater recharge slightly, for approximately 4% to the pond itself. In terms of flows to the treatment plant, those are 20,000 gallons per day under current conditions, 26,700 under future conditions. That's not a large percentage of the flow that goes to the treatment plant today. Would accomplish this through a low-pressure sewer system, which would connect to the existing sewer system on Main Street. So there'd be no conventional sewers or pump stations. Each property would have its own small grinder-style pump station for a low-pressure system. And the only real issue with this approach is is there any capacity at the Blacksmith Shop Road treatment plant? So the other plan, Plan 5, is what we call advanced IA system. So total nitrogen less than 10 reliably. That would require all 243 dwelling units in the watershed to convert their regular septic system or cesspool to an advanced IA system. The reason for the significant increase is because some of the nitrogen stays in the watershed. It's treated, reduced substantially, but it stays in the watershed. Similarly, some amount of phosphorus remains in the watershed. There would be no change in freshwater recharge because the same amount of water would be going to Oyster Pond. And the issues with this approach is that there really aren't too many options systems that can achieve this level. And none of them are approved for general use by DEP at this point. The other issue that we've worked through with the town and the committee is how do you monitor compliance with the TMDL when there's 243 units out in the system, as opposed to a conventional approach where you know it's all going to the sewer. We've worked through that a bit, but it's still a complication. So in terms of cost estimates, we developed two cost models. We looked at current conditions and future conditions. So for the 6 plans we developed, we developed cost estimates for everything at planning horizon with the build out. We then shortlisted to Plan 1 and Plan 5 and ran another cost iteration for what is the cost to comply with the TMDLs based on current condition. So there's 2 sets of costs. We used capital and O&M unit costs from the Barnstable County Cost Report, but we also supplemented that with Falmouth-specific information for things like septic pumping costs, pumping frequency, information from the watershed as well. What's the cost to run the existing treatment plant? What are the costs to put in low-pressure systems based on the town's experience on Mare Vista area? So we tried to localize the information as well. This was really, it was an idea that we came up with together with the Oyster Pond Subcommittee, but the subcommittee then proceeded to work through things with DEP and the commission to come up with an approach that is clever and would save a lot of money using a municipal framework to do this monitoring rather than having 243 monitoring programs all through the system. Make it so that it's a managed approach and use more of a statistical approach to save money and achieve the same environmental result. And then we included typical planning level allowances for the things that we don't yet know, site investigations, legal, administrative, technical services. So for the planning horizon, Plan 1, sewer was $8 million, and Plan 5, the IA system approach was $8.4 million. We calculated an equivalent annual cost in total for the whole system, for the whole watershed. And an equivalent annual cost in our analysis is the debt service on the capital plus the annual O&M cost. We then divided that by the number of dwelling units that were in the plan and compared those. So Plan 1 equivalent annual cost per dwelling unit is $3,440 versus $4,040. And then we looked at the last metric was equivalent annual cost per pound of nitrogen removed. So this is a cost efficiency metric. Per dollar that we're spending, how much nitrogen are we removing, and you can see that the sewer Plan 1 approach is more cost effective from that metric. Plan 1 and Plan 5 had better metrics, cost metrics, than all the other plans, which is why we shortlisted to these 2. The other thing, oops, sorry for that formatting issue. Costs are presented in 2013 dollars, because that's when we ran all these numbers.
So these are 2013 numbers?
Correct.
All these numbers we're looking at?
Correct. Okay, so, sorry for this. This is conservative, Plan 5, conservative monitoring framework. Those words go together. The notes on the costs and equivalent annual cost are the same as the previous slide. So you can see here the capital costs are a lot closer. You can see that the equivalent annual cost per dwelling unit are also closer, and from the cost efficiency perspective, there's still a fairly dramatic difference between the 2. But in terms of meeting the TMDL under current conditions, both projects are about $7 million.
Would the cost be considered equivalent within 10%?
Why don't we let him finish the presentation and then we get into questions from the committee.
So next steps. Develop the recommended plan. So we have 2 choices. There's a number of details that need to get ironed out that are really macro details that aren't directly related to Oyster Pond that will allow us to make the final recommendation or in concert with the subcommittee. So we're looking for Water Quality Management Committee input. We've discussed setting a date for a public input meeting, another watershed public input meeting in August. There's been lots of discussion about whether or not disposal capacity exists at the Blacksmith Shop Road plant. We need to reassess that reality and make a decision on that. I'm proposing January 2019, recognizing that there's a lot of pieces to it, but it's essential to completing this project. We need to complete the West Falmouth Harbor evaluation that was began a couple years ago. I again proposed January 2019, and that's essential to completing this project. If those slide, this would slide. We need to collectively affirm that watershed management framework with DEP. There's been numerous meetings with DEP, but I think one last meeting to say, okay, here's the plan, here's the monitoring framework, are we good? You know, that's an important piece to resolve after the previous two are done. We need to quantify nutrient reductions that have occurred in the system since MEP did their work. We know there are some things. Stormwater systems have been adjusted somewhat. There's been some land that's purchased towards conservation. There's a handful of things. We know that atmospheric deposition trends have changed. There's a little bit of improvements that have occurred in inputs, nitrogen inputs to the system that we want to account for as a part of this. And then develop a phasing plan. We know we're not going to expect everybody to go out and do a construction project in year one. So we'll develop a phasing plan and a environmental monitoring plan. Funding, how are we going to pay for the plan, and then do our final coordinations with DEP, MEPA, the commission, and submit a draft report for review through the town's normal processes, with going to this committee and then presenting drafts to the Board of Selectmen.
Can I take issue with just that last point?
Sure.
This is a key slide. So a draft report for the community to review. This is actually a draft comprehensive wastewater management plan, draft environmental impact report, also as it's submittal to DEP, MEP, MEPA?
Yeah, we
Correct?
do have that as a part of our scope, yeah.
Okay, all right. So I just want, so what I'm leading up to is the, quote, final report is final only in the sense that this is the official document that the selectmen have reviewed and voted and sent to the state. But it is a draft CWMP and a draft EIR. Do you understand?
Okay.
Okay.
So it's our final draft report.
It's, yeah, right, and that's very important when you think back to what happened with the town, with the CWMP for the South Coast estuaries. We had a false start, and then we had a real draft submitted, and then a lot changed in that year between the time the state, all its agencies looked at it, and then we had a final CWMP EIR that resulted in a number of changes, including the Little Pond Sewer Service Area. So the state has a process. What we submit is a draft.
Any other comments from the committee? Matt?
So you mentioned phosphorus as, potentially a limiting nutrient at certain times of the year. Do we know whether or not phosphorus is actually a problem in terms of inputs from groundwater to the estuary?
There is not a TMDL for phosphorus. There are times a year when, based on the salinity of the water body, where the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio gets in the range where phosphorus is partially a limiting nutrient. So it's important. I guess it's not a driver, but it's important to keep in mind.
But we have no idea whether or not there's actually a phosphorus input problem.
We know there's a phosphorus input because it's part of leachate from septic systems or cesspools. As far as whether it's a problem, We're identifying it as something that's it's part of the reason, it is part of the reason why,
Okay.
yes.
Because in my experience, phosphorus is actually trapped pretty effectively in the aquifer.
Okay.
In many cases.
Behind sediment.
Can I follow up on that?
And-
And I would agree on a lot-by-lot basis that it is trapped. I believe the one place that you have the potential for it not being trapped, and it's just because there's so much of it, and that's treetops. That you have an area that is on the upstream side of Oyster Pond, and you have somewhat concentrated discharge points, because they have multiple units discharging to one septic system, and they're close enough that given enough travel time, you could have anoxic conditions, and then the phosphorus would
Okay.
travel.
Just, and I guess one last point on
Yep.
that is that most of the water bodies are within a 10-year travel time and have been there longer than 10 years. So any sequestration or trapping that would occur if under a travel time aspect would hit steady state. So I agree with that statement, but I think in this case where there's so many parcels that are within a short travel time that it's a component.
Okay. And then the other question was about sort of the timeline for implementation, because I think with respect to the IA option, the advanced IA option, you know, as the technology matures, there becomes more options, the cost may come down
Right.
for the installation part. And also related to that were these cost estimates based on what it would cost to put in an individual system, or sort of like bulk purchasing, like hiring one contractor to do all of the installations and equipment purchases, et cetera.
We didn't really try and play with that knob yet. I mean, I think because there's a lot that goes into that, and I know the town has done that with procurement of low-pressure pumping systems, and it's certainly a sensitivity analysis that could be done. The expectation, I guess we haven't really gotten into the phasing the approach to phasing, but we would expect in an IA scenario that there might be some people that have recently done work on their property, and you wouldn't want to, unless you had to for some environmental reason, tell them that they had to replace that immediately with a new system. And so, you know, this is going to take place over a period of time that needs to be discussed and determined. At this point, there have not been any mandates for completion from the regulatory agencies. So we don't know how flexible they'll be over the long term and how many years by which we need to complete.
So we're not going to put a date on when this would be started? You know, is it 10 years, is it 20? Is this one of the ones that's coming next?
Well, the town has its own sort of timeline based on finances.
Yes.
And that'll be governing our recommendations. Whether or not it's universally agreed to is another question. But the town, our policy has been, we're not going to ask the town to do capital expenditures that involve a tax increase. So that limits the time frame to years when that can be done without a tax increase.
Eric, can I speak to Matt's question about the
Sure.
single unit?
Right. Steve also has a presentation following this one.
But specifically, Matt brought up a good point about possible cost savings with bulk purchasing. But Ed's point is also completely valid. The problem with doing that now is, one, the technology is evolving. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't wait for better technology while figuring out what the mass production cost is of something that you don't even know what it is yet. And two, John Waterbury has pointed out that there is another huge advantage of having a single technology from the standpoint of the town maintaining it and lowering those costs. But the other thing is that the savings won't be as much as you might think, because a huge fraction of the cost is some guy with a backhoe doing something specific to somebody's yard, and that's not mass production.
I wanted to say one more thing about costs and timeline, because that's this list of of task is a little weak on that. So the next time that the town has a debt drop-off is the year 2025. And so if the town is going to vote any particular specific bonds related to that particular debt drop-off, those votes come in 2023, usually for design, and 2024 for construction dollars, and then we begin to incur the costs in 2025. That's if the costs are large. But did I read Plan 1 is 8 million and Plan 5 is 8.4 million? Mm-hmm. So this is a discussion that needs to take place with the financial director, because although we have a major debt drop-off in 2025, there are sometimes spaces in between, sooner than that. But that sort of begins to give us some sort of time frame to answer your question about when this might happen. And I think in terms of planning and in terms of moving this whole project forward for Oyster Pond and all the residents in that watershed, that if they have a time frame that the town has made some sort of decisions between now and 2025, I think that tends to keep the momentum going and to keep focus. Some of the key decisions that have to be made are where's the discharge going to go? And so if this Oyster Pond project moves forward and the decision is sewers, then the discharge issue has to be answered. And we have other reasons why we wanted to decide on discharge, but this adds to that.
Now, Steve had a presentation. Do you want to make it now? What's your pleasure?
It's up to you. I mean, whether you want to finish questions to Ed, I mean, there's quite a bit of overlap. I mean, what I'm going to say is it won't take more than 5 or 6 minutes.
Why don't you go ahead?
I'm intending to stay for as long as you want, so we can circle around.
Yeah.
What's the total load that you think we should remove with wastewater treatment? How many pounds per year do we actually end up?
It was on that second slide.
It was, yes.
Yes, but not quite.
1,156 is the number of pounds that it will allow, and if you go back, I think you had the number of pounds that were actually,
4,000 something.
yes, right, and we just need to
Right.
do the math. That's the gallons per day,
There.
so
So it's about 3,000
about 3,000.
Pounds per year.
Right.
per year.
While we're doing this, do you think we could get Steve's set up?
There's just a single PowerPoint of it.
Yeah.
It's running off the thumb drive, so don't make it. That one and
If you want, Mr. Hale and Bill and Opet, if you want to just come forward and sit in the front row, you're going to be part of this conversation, I have a feeling. Well,
Yes.
yeah, but at least we could, yeah, right.
We would like to comment after you've gone through Steve's.
Okay.
All right. I just wanted to, there's a lot of overlap with Ed's excellent presentation. I just thought there were some issues that needed to get out there. And everyone should feel free to add or correct this. I knew Ed would be covering all the monetary comparisons, so I just wanted to make sure all the non-monetary ones were brought out. In the case of the sewer, didn't we do, no, the IA is first, I think. I think you already jumped. The IAs do not require finding and permitting a place to put the effluent. It affords a chance to pilot test the technology for the whole rest of Falmouth. It might be available sooner, and the technology is evolving. Of course, those last two are sort of, you can't have both. If you're waiting for an evolved technology, by definition, you can't do it sooner. You have to pick one or the other. And the next one. The sewer is a totally proven technology. There's thousands of installations. I know we're not mandated to handle contaminants of emerging concern, but if it ever did become an issue, you can do it in one place with professionals instead of in whatever it is, 176 different places. It's virtually immune to household chemical poisoning because it's diluted by everybody else. You can only affect 1 on thousandth of what goes in there. It does not require convincing the Mass DEP to allow IAs without general approval. And this is controversial. The landscaping costs are variable and maybe less. And I should have said that for the IAs, they do not require, no, I maybe did say, don't require permitting of a new way of getting rid of effluents. Right. Next. They both require permitting, just different kinds. Now, there may be a lot of people here who know the difference between profit and loss and cash flow, but there may be people that don't. Profit and loss is where you end up at the end of some period of time. Cash flow is how you get there. Assume that they both cost the same thing. Both cost $100. Obviously, it's considerably more than that, but the math is a lot simpler for 100. And assume 0% loans. Assume a 70% betterment for sewers and a grant for IA set to about 30%. In the case of the sewers, the town borrows $100 and gets reimbursed $70 from the property owners over time. In the case of IAs, the property owner borrows $100 and gets reimbursed $30 from the town immediately. Where the town comes up with that $30 is the town's business. The next one. In both cases, the town spends $30 and the property owner spends $70, but different parties pay upfront in the two different cases. And reality involves many other details, including loan availability to each party, annual costs, and landscaping. And the $30 may be easier to sell to town meeting than the $100. And going forward, as Ed said, we have to search for effluent disposal locations, apply for watershed permitting to allow currently unapproved IAs to be allowed, and performance testing and review of new improved IAs.
That's one mean snapping turtle.
He was 11 inches long.
Yeah.
Not just the shell.
Is that a comment on our speed?
No, but we need hard shells to withstand the comment.
All right, comments, questions from the committee? There's a lot more nuances to every single thing he put up there today, and we'd be happy to get into the weeds as much as you like, but there are a lot of weeds. One weed in particular is, as we all talk sort of as if sewering is an option, the caveat is if there's a discharge capacity at the town treatment plant. And right now there is not. So the town is looking at the possibility of different kinds of additional discharge sites. Some of them are never been done before. Some of them are very expensive. All of them are very expensive. And all of them require a mountain of permitting before they actually could happen. So there's a time factor and there's a cost factor to that assumption that there's going to be a discharge site. Right now there isn't, and nobody can tell you when there will be, or where or what it will be. So that's the big caveat about sewering. You've all heard the other caveats about IAs, and we have more to come. But comments from the audience. Jerry Potamus, former wastewater superintendent.
Jerry Potamus, just precinct 2 member. I live town of Falmouth. A couple of things on Ed's presentation. I think in the past, and I have discussed this with DEP, if the plan says you have a progressive schedule, and let's say for INA systems, to say every 2 years you're going to do a certain percent, or every 5 years, I think the state could approve a phased INA system, but the town would have to commit to it and commit the homeowners to it. The other thing, whoever said the bulk saving, I know in the Little Pond Sewer Service area, they said, oh, we'll get a guy with a backhoe who'll dig a trench. In reality, it's the landscaping costs that will drive you up. My landscaping cost was 2 to 3 times my installation costs. And there'd be a big question whether the town will pick up landscaping costs. I think you mentioned betterment. I think using private money for public is going to be a big deal. You could pass something that allows the town to pay for it or even own the septic tanks. We did something similar for the E1 pumps. I think the costs are about equal for engineering. I think they were within 10%. I know you have one better than the other, but for practical purposes, those costs, although they spread out later, seem to be about the same. The other thing is, I'm not sure that there is no capacity at if the 80% capacity is 20% of 700,000, the available capacity is 140,000, and that's with Little Pond Sewer built out in maybe some infill from the town. And I think Amy has it. Amy's numbers are very conservative because she uses Title V flows. And I know the flow neutral bylaw requires it for commercial development, but that's usually 2 to 3 times the flow of actuality. And I use the example, a home, Title V, 440 is what 4 bedrooms would be. I don't know if you're using it here, 150 gallons is the average. And there's no reason not to believe, and maybe you could look into it, on Title V flows, well, this is for commercial, so, I mean for residential, so I think the flows should be okay. I don't think, at one time, there was one individual that had a phosphorus system, but he also had a proprietary nitrogen system. No one's trying to push those things together anymore. Maybe it'd be too complex and it wouldn't, since you don't have a phosphorus TMDL, if there was something you added on to an INA system, it may have some benefit. I think that says it about, I think it's like you said, those are weeds in the future that you got to dig into. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask Jerry a question?
Steve, yeah, Jerry, don't go
Jerry,
away.
you implied an advantage to something you described as phased IA systems. What
Well,
did you mean?
Ed had said right now, the state doesn't say how long you have to comply with the TMDL. That was a big question with the EPA, whether it was 5, 10, 15 years, and people used to do a tap dance. And then they did the tap dance when it was big projects like combined sewer overflows that would bankrupt large cities. Doesn't matter if you're going bankrupt. There may be a progressive way, if you wanted to go with INA, to say there'd be a mapping schedule. You have to do the 20% in 2 years. So whatever that schedule could work out to, it may be possible. I think Wareham might have did it with their low pressure sewers. I'm not sure. I know Mr. Corford brought it up 6 or 7 years ago. I thought he was off the wall. And since then, I think I've understood the state may be flexible with a firm schedule. It will be part of the NPDES, the state permit for the wastewater treatment plant, I imagine. So I think it has some teeth.
Yeah, we have talked to DEP about that, and they agree with what you're saying. The phasing is doable.
Yep.
But politically and economically, it would be incredibly complicated.
Well,
Yeah.
that may be, but it's doable. Everything we do here is
Right.
complicated. OPET. All right. First one, then the other?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bill Kerfoot, Board of Directors of Oyster Pond. Also been on the Water Quality Committee for quite some time, where Oyster Pond set up its own analysis of the oyster pond concentrations of both nitrogen and phosphorus. We've monitored wells, we've looked at characteristics of runoff. We've looked at the total mass that has actually been coming into Oyster Pond. Relative to this, I think this is the most important thing I can add to the discussion at the present time. So I went over with 3 separate winter times where there's no biological removal activity. And from our best information right now of the inflow from the groundwater and the condition of the pond during the winter time to look to see the total amount of nitrogen that would be actually flowing in from the groundwater. So that's primarily the sewage type. And in fact, our greatest look was at the northern area where treetops is. But since it well mixes, it was for the pond as a whole. Much to my surprise, what I had found was that the total nitrogen input and this is during the winter time, was only 50% of what was expected. And much less than what would be total. Now, I would like to raise a reasonable question here, which might save the town some money on this, in that this is moraine areas. I recently had a septic system redone in my own backyard, and we cut down over 15 feet down through the moraine. It's very clear, as many people know, you actually have alternating layers. So you go to tight, and then you go to and you go to tight. Many of these show denitrification. So I think it is very reasonable, this is directed at Virginia and the scientific type community and Hui too, to raise a question whether the assumption that there is no removal of nitrogen when the wastewater reaches the groundwater table and moves laterally to flow into the pond is a real one. That is the basis in our current model. I think you could probably make a reasonable case, even being very conservative, that there would be expected to be a 30% loss of the nitrogen in transit from septic systems that are some distance back. So in other words, whereas it included 100% of that in the watershed, I think a reasonable consideration would certainly be to perhaps remove 30% or so that are on that very long tail, which goes up, is still considered watershed, but is a very long distance from the source. And this is not entirely new. There's been other considerations on other site areas where this has been taken into account. But that way, you can save definitely some cost to the town, certainly for extending sewer line type of hookups long distances. Compare that with not needing that because it's not a significant percentage of the nitrogen coming in. Mm-hmm. The other aspect on the runoff phosphorus versus septic system phosphorus, we did put wells opposite treetops to look at the phosphorus content coming in. We verified that yes, nitrogen, the largest problem right now is nitrogen loading, no question. Nitrogen was elevated in those. Surprisingly, phosphorus was not. Now it takes quite some time for these phosphorus plumes to really develop and move. Virginia is aware of that, and her husband. And when you do through the actual calculations of the total phosphorus load, you come up with, yes, you have to pay attention to the phosphorus, but what we have tried to do in Oyster Pond is to say to people like the Ransom Road Association, put in stormwater containment, and that has been done to try and reduce phosphorus. We also, which we'll have a little bit more comments on this. We have also gone forward and purchased significant amount of property, the 22 acres of Hui, which were not in the original computations and need to be considered. And Ed mentioned that.
I think Ed has taken that into account.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Hi,
Wendy Vissler, Executive Director of OPET. Just since we're talking about the phosphorus question, I do know that Dr. Valiella had a bump program that he ran out of MBL with students, and they did do an experiment where they took Oyster pond water, added nitrogen, added phosphorus to some, and then added nitrogen and phosphorus to some. And the highest growth of algae was with both. So it's the phosphorus plus nitrogen in Oyster Pond really seems to activate the algae. So just nitrogen, yes, is a problem. Just phosphorus doesn't seem to be as much. But when the two are combined, we do see that there's a mixture that definitely seems to activate stuff. So it's just something to think about. This was a very simple experiment. I can't recall what the numbers were and the amounts that they used, but it does occur in Oyster Pond. The other thing is, in my own mind to clarify, so with sewering, we have the question to get down in the weeds is the discharge. For the INAs, it's the monitoring program, and I guess MEP as to whether they will allow a watershed plan, a TMDL watershed plan, to be met with just these low INAs. Have you been talking to DEP about this? And
we have.
How are they open to this, or
They are.
There still isn't any other place in the state that's done this. Is that correct?
Right.
So we would be breaking ground. And also then with the monitoring, I know there was some discussion earlier about how, I know Barnstable County monitors, I guess, most of the INAs, because all the INAs on the Cape. I guess the same thing would be expanded to the watershed. And I know there was discussion maybe of having the town own these septic systems or have them privately owned, or I guess that's still part of the down in the weed discussion that has to happen. Or
Right. We've been having it among ourselves. And as we get familiar enough with the issues and the pros and the cons, we'll bring it further. But until we've talked to ourselves and to DEP and to the MEP people and to everyone involved, it's kind of premature to draw any conclusions.
Right. But it's so complicated. Both of these plans have so many unknowns. The discharge is a big one with the sewering.
Right.
And using INAs to meet a TMDL is huge too. So I think both, it's not that one plan is very easy to do over the other. They both have a lot of unanswered questions and breaking new ground, at least for the INAs. So, okay, thanks.
Absolutely. Jerry.
One last follow-up. I'm still Jerry Thomas, Eric's favorite person. In talking to the Buzzards Bay Coalition, there's something Mr. Waterbury probably knows this, the concentration of nitrogen going into septic tanks is going up, primarily because the water use is going down. And the number that the state uses of 35, I think, is probably half of what it could be, or should be. But that's a regulatory battle, and I think Corinne said she's monitoring some nitrogen concentrations in that further reduction in flow from low flow toilets from 1.2 to half a gallon per day or something like that will definitely increase the concentration. The load doesn't go up, but when you're trying to balance numbers and you're talking concentration, you have to keep your eye on the flow and the total load. Thank you.
Absolutely. I believe Mr. Hale.
That's okay. No, I had two questions. First question, I'm Richard Hale. I'm a resident at Treetops. I'm also on the OPET board. A question on that, is increasing concentration a good thing or a bad thing? I didn't really get that.
It's neither, so long as you have the right flow that you're calculating, because concentration times flow gives you mass, okay? So you just have to figure it out, and maybe there's no difference. I think there might be if you're thinking total I&A, but I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
So I have a couple of questions, just to be sure I understand what I heard. First of all, Ed, right? For option one, when you were presenting that, you said, I think you said sewer septic systems will be removed. Is that accurate, that if we put in a sewer, the septic systems have to be dug up and totally gone?
Yep.
Just get filled in.
Filled in, crushed and filled in.
Filled in. I realize people don't use them, but,
They get filled in.
I have personally had it done.
okay.
They come in with a truck of incredibly inexpensive, cheap quality concrete that doesn't really harden in case you ever want to excavate and put something there. You don't want a concrete block. They pour this stuff in and they're done.
Okay. So my original question was, I didn't really understand whether the blacksmith shop road had capacity. We were trying to figure out what it was, but now I understand it has no capacity unless a place to put the effluent is found and permitted.
Discharge
Discharge.
capacity. It's different from processing capacity.
Okay,
It
got it.
has processing capacity.
Okay, so, and if that can't happen, then the only option is option 5, doing the IA systems?
True, except that the town has a responsibility for all the south coast estuaries, and that's the other comprehensive wastewater management plan that we're working on.
Right.
And so we have to have an answer for that. Some of that will have to be sewered, so we have to solve the disposal question for a number of areas.
Okay.
Which are much larger.
Which are
than
larger
Oyster
than Oyster Pond.
And if this isn't appropriate to address now, just tell me, but the cost apportionment or cost allocation, is there a model for that? I mean, he had a 70-30 kind of thing. How does that translate to a homeowner? What does that mean?
That was the model in the Heights, Mara Vista.
Okay.
And basically, they took the total cost of the project. The town paid a portion. Basically, the town paid for everything except the collection system in the neighborhoods. They paid for the pump stations, things like that. The portion that was left was divided up among the 1,600 and some homeowners and businesses in the area. And that's the 70%. In their case, it worked out to $13,000 per sewer equivalent unit, homeowners. That doesn't mean it would be that same price.
I understand. It kind of gets to where,
anywhere
in my
else.
mind, I'm thinking, okay, there are, I don't remember the exact number, it seemed like a pretty small number of homeowners that could be paying for a very expensive infrastructure. Do I have that right?
It's possible. The betterment in New Silver Beach was much higher than that.
Yes.
So there's a long history in Falmouth of that split of 30% to the town, 70% to the homeowner, the bettered party. So we've done that with roads. That's typically the portion when private roads are taken. The town will puts in 30%. The bettered parties put in 70%.
Right.
In New Silver Beach, when we did that, that was 30% the town put in, the homeowners put in 70. So there's a long precedent for that split.
Just want to be sure I understood.
But I just one clarification. The town usually pays for the capital costs of the infrastructure. It's the collection system where the property is bettered. So if they say, I'll just take Little Ponds project as an example. If they say this is a $40 million sewer project, $40 million included the pump stations and the force mains and everything. The homeowners didn't pay a betterment on that. The town footed the whole bill for that. The homeowners paid for the sub-cost, which was just the collection system in their neighborhood.
Okay.
And they paid 70% of that.
And you're right, you would have 173
Yes.
homeowners in your area splitting the cost of the collection system.
The 173, I think in prior meetings this was discussed, but just so I understand that's the minimum number of homes that is required to get down to the TMBL.
Exactly.
And how do you choose the lucky 173 versus the unlucky 70?
Steve.
I mean, the lucky 70. Steve's going to do it, right?
That's a fair question. The rule of thumb in your area probably would be just propinquity to the water body.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I know treetops is going to be in that number, but I'm just curious.
It will.
And some of these questions are talking to neighbors and others about this August meeting. You know, I think some people have an expectation, or maybe not, that's probably too strong a word, but they have an image that all these questions are going to be answered in August. You know, the when, the how much, the what are we going to do. And I realize I disabuse them of that. But these are questions that people are already kind of moving to for, you know, obvious reasons. And at Treetops, we are in the latter stage of a big refurbishment, big and expensive refurbishment. So people are aware of what big projects can cost and what the impact personally to them is. So I do think that that will be a topic that is raised if it's not addressed directly at the August meeting.
I would assume that the level of presentation in August will be exactly what you heard today.
Okay.
And with the same degrees of certainty. So
Yeah,
when that community sits down in August, they will be getting the presentation that Ed made today with all of the assumptions that you heard this afternoon.
Yeah, Steve?
And the problem of how do you select the lucky 100 and so properties is not limited to Oyster Pond. Many of the other estuaries have the same problem. And I think we're all kicking that can down the road as far as we can. It's not, but the closer a property is to the water, the more effect it has. And it's probably a more valuable property and more likely to be a second home. So therefore, it's presumably more affordable to them. I mean, I've just heard those comments made by a variety of people.
Historically, when we did New Silver Beach, that little service that had 200 homes, the Board of Health walked around, and in our best estimate, we decided this is where we need to draw the line. What has happened historically since we put that sewer in is people outside of that area have said, boy, wouldn't I like to be hooked to that sewer. So the chances are that, you know, when we draw a line around whatever we do in Oyster Pond, in the future, people who are outside of it and then have to replace an expensive Title V system are going to say, why wasn't I put in that little box?
I think that's a good point. So.
Well, as Jerry knew from the Heights in Mara Vista, there were probably a certain number of people who had the exact opposite response, which, why am I in this? So
They're fighting to get back in. Don't forget the tax benefit. That's tax benefit.
That's right. You're right. There's a tax credit.
Right. Mr. Hale,
Yes.
I'm very glad you're talking to residents, and particularly since many of them are seasonal. I think it's really important to have this summer meeting to bring them along. They may be seasonal, but ultimately it affects their taxes. And I agree with John that probably the August presentation will be similar to what you saw here. I do think that there will be substantial information by January of next year. We will have information on the West Falmouth IA experiment, and we will have moved farther into a public discussion on discharge sites, how many options and what the problems are. So there will be more information evolving over this next year. I go back to my point earlier that ultimately the report that will be voted by the selectmen about a year from now, and that will ultimately be sent to the state by the end of 2019, is a draft CWMP. So it is the town's best effort to plan to solve this problem in Oyster Pond that we've assembled with the information that's available at that time. The subsequent final CWMP, the final plan, and the final environmental impact report could be coming a year after that, might even be longer, but it allows for a lot more input. So it's gradually getting more and more specific on finding solutions. It's very important that the residents, particularly the seasonal residents, stay tuned in, because I can't tell you how, oh, really? There's going to be a sewer here? I knew nothing about it.
Right. Well, we actually, for the last public meeting, which unfortunately I couldn't attend, Treetops bore the expense of mailing out the entire, I don't know what that document was called, but where you outlined the 7 or so options, that initial plan to everyone, encouraged people to go, and we were pretty disappointed with the turnout from our community, even though it was in the summer or whatever. But we're trying. Meredith Golden, who has been to these meetings before, couldn't be here today, and she's sort of the official communicator for this topic. But if there is material or information that we can specifically, I'm also on the Treetops board, as is Meredith, we can specifically distribute to our residents that would be helpful for this August meeting, we would certainly be happy to do that.
Right.
Okay.
Good.
Great.
Richard, you can also tell them they can watch this meeting on TV, and if they really liked it, they can see it live in August.
That's right. We'll send something out on Constant Contact.
Yes.
And hopefully, Ed did.
And Ed's report will be on the web, right?
That will. I think we'll have one that's a little more user friendly.
I'm putting it in our newsletter too.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Oh, wow.
But just because we're talking to an audience that will be less attuned than this one to the jargon.
Okay.
So, Ed did make a request that if it could be changed to the 15th instead of the 14th, it would please him. Is that possible, do you think?
CEO was arranging that. I've not been in direct contact with the SEA people.
About that. It may be possible, but I couldn't say it until we asked.
Okay, could you find out?
August 15th?
Is that the problem?
Yeah, what was the
I
time?
think that's fine.
It was the evening.
Yeah, I think
Evening?
it was 6.
Yeah.
Okay, so it depends on the facility being available.
If it's not, the 14th works. It just would be,
Yeah, we try to accommodate.
the One Cape thing is the next day, so is the 16th.
Oh, that's
That's right.
Oh, so you'd want to be down for that, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it's not available, the 14th will work just fine.
Yeah.
Ed, is it possible to send your slide deck either as a PowerPoint or a Word document is fine if you just capture the slides to us?
Yeah,
Yes.
you should be able to.
That was a
forward
very
that.
good summary. I liked it.
Good.
And Steve, I liked yours a lot too. That was good.
So, yeah, the time of day for this meeting, 6 o'clock seems like sort of a meal time for people. I wonder if we want to have it earlier or later.
Well, later being like 6:30 or 7?
Well, it was, as of now, it's 6:30 on the 14th, right? Until we, but we might change it to the 15th.
Right. I'm asking about the time of day.
Yeah, I know.
wasn't sure what time.
6:30.
6:30 is
Is
fine.
it? Okay, people aren't eating at
The
6:30?
planning board now meets at 6:30, the zoning board of appeals meets at 6, everybody's meeting at 6:30.
You're happy, I'm happy.
Okay, yeah, I think 6:30
Pizza.
works. And that, people are home by now.
I vaguely recall the last time we used SEA, they wanted us out of there by a certain hour, and that was part of the reason for picking 6:30 then.
I think that's
We're there.
part of it, they want you out by 9.
All right. Any other comments or questions or about the Oyster Pond Draft CWMP overview? Okay,
Thank you, Ed.
if not, thank you for coming.
They may also be interested in this notification.
Yes.
Why don't you report that?
All right, before you take off, we want everyone to know that the Buzzards Bay Coalition is putting on a presentation on Friday, June 29th, at the Falmouth Academy Simon Center from 1 to 5 about the West Falmouth project and the IAs and the status of the treatment plant upgrade, and all kinds of things that are relevant to everything we've been talking about today. 1 to 5, with a reception from 5 to 6.
If you share that with us,
Yeah.
I'll give it to you.
They originally planned this mostly for West Falmouth folks, but I think this is,
This is of great interest to Oyster Pond folks.
We could put that in an OPET newsletter too,
yeah.
if it's not too late. Oh,
Okay. All right, report of members and staff. Who has a report?
The EPA proposal for the PRB, proposed PRB installation at 0 Shorewood Drive was submitted on time and acknowledged as being received by the EPA, and we should have some news sometime in July.
In July.
you have
Good.
fireworks
Let
set
you know.
aside?
Yeah, try to have the email come in while we're meeting.
That was pretty dramatic last
It
time.
was, yeah.
Fingers crossed.
All we need is a clarion trumpet call.
That was very nice. Okay, the town selectmen have appointed a Shellfish Advisory Committee, one member of whom is required to be a Water Quality Committee designee, and Tom has agreed to be our designee on that one. The charge has changed a bit. They now have two tasks. One is to support the mission of the Marine Environmental Services Department to preserve, protect, and enhance shellfish populations to sustain recreational and commercial shellfishing in a manner that is consistent with promoting the overall health of the marine ecosystems. The committee will also support the mission of the Water Quality Management Committee to improve water quality in town estuaries in a cost-effective manner by increasing nitrogen uptake by shellfish. So the question of what they're supposed to watch out for has been answered, and we will have someone at the table to participate in.
Yeah, have they finished appointing people to the committee?
They had the interviews on Monday. I
Oh,
don't know
okay.
if they finished or not.
So that decision is farther down.
Not far.
Do we know how many people?
10 had applied, and they had 8 slots
Oh,
available, so.
Maximum 8 slots.
Right.
They discussed having a committee anywhere from 5 to 9. And they had 10 applications. We have 1 slot, so they.
and do you want to say anything about Monday morning's meeting that I missed?
Just, this was a working meeting with Division of Marine and Environmental Sciences. John and I went. It was to discuss with Greg Frazier and Chuck Martinson exactly what aquaculture is going on in each estuary. And so we just had basically a rundown on all of that. We, as you probably remember, have SMAST working a research project in Bourne, and so we need to stay coordinated on that. It was basically just a working session.
Okay.
I went to a meeting on Monday put on by the USGS and the EPA of a nutrient innovation showcase, they called it. And it was, Dennis LeBanc put on a very good presentation, which I'm hopeful he'll be able to do for us in the fall. And Suffolk County of New York put on a very interesting presentation, which suggests that we're further along than they are in many respects. They have a much bigger problem. It's a lot more populated place with a lot more cesspools and a lot more densely populated and a lot more everything. And I was kind of taken aback to see that they had not progressed in many respects as far as we had in figuring out what they needed to do. So anyway, they've agreed to put on the same presentation for us. It would be distance, they'd be in New York doing it, but this can be done now. So I think at one of our next couple of meetings, we'll have that presentation to look at. Any other reports of members and staff?
Is it premature to mention that what the IA committee met with George and saw that presentation by Dr. Smith?
It's too late now. You've already let the cat out of the
Well,
bag.
I haven't said what he said or anything about it.
Well,
I mean, it was another new IA system that might or might not be promising. But he also was able to get substantial funding for it from the CEC.
This is the guy that's working on Martha's Vineyard.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, as we said earlier, this is evolving. So that's great.
Yeah.
It's
All right.
technology.
Okay, minutes of the prior meeting were distributed. Any comments or corrections or additions?
One minor
Of course.
point. Down in the letter of support for the SNAP grant, the
Yes.
the terminal sentence in that section, instead of filter, I'd suggest remove nitrogen.
Yeah.
When you say filtering, it sounds like we're accumulating it somewhere.
Right.
Direct quote of the verbal
Yeah, yeah, but I just suggest remove,
Yeah, that's a better word.
and then I'll let that sleeping dog lie.
All right.
I move that they be accepted as just amended.
I'll second it.
Moved and seconded. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it.
Abstaining.
Anything to report on, I guess, no. Schedule. Summer is coming, summer is here. Our usual would be the 1st and 3rd, which would be the July 5th and July 19th. July 5th seems inappropriate, just because it's after the July 4th.
We could bump both meetings back 1 week.
The 19th, the East Falmouth Village Association is going to have a meeting that evening, and Brian Howes and his researcher are going to be there to talk about Mill Pond. So
And that's a definite?
that's a definite.
Okay, so that's the 19th,
19th, yeah.
East
Could we
Falmouth.
just use that as our meeting?
Use that as our meeting, and maybe,
Just be there?
We could.
okay.
It's at 7 o'clock. It's at the East Falmouth.
Library?
St. Anthony's Church Hall.
Oh, good.
Air-conditioned, folding chairs, very, very posh.
7 PM on July 19th.
Yes.
Okay, so we would post our meeting for 7 PM. It would be posted to be at St. Anthony's.
Okay.
Well, would it really be our meeting? I mean,
We can do that.
I don't mind it, but I'm just saying,
What else
are we,
might,
do they want us holding a meeting as part of that?
Well, we
We don't.
wouldn't do much holding. I think we'd just.
Well, that's what I meant.
We'd
be passive, I think.
We'd all be there, but would it really be a meeting?
Oh, if we're all there, it should be a posted
We
meeting.
normally do that.
So then the next thing would be August 14th or 15th. This presentation, or a variation on this presentation. Should that be our August meeting? It seems like we're,
Well, that's the same day as the.
well, that's what I'm asking, whether that would be our only gathering time in August, or whether we should do more in August.
Well, maybe we just decide.
Oh, I see, that would, in the same way, be our meeting.
Yeah. Maybe in July, we decide whether we need another meeting other than the August meeting.
Okay, okay.
If we don't have, I mean, sometimes if we're just doing things,
Right.
then those become the meetings.
Sure.
Okay.
All right.
So we'll just say that we've set the July 19th meeting for 7 PM at St. Anthony's
Mhm.
in conjunction with the East Falmouth Village Association and the Mill Pond presentation. Okay.
Okay. Matt?
Motion to adjourn?
Second?
Moved and second. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?